So we are now recording. So I'm going to try and record this so that anybody who is not here today can still actually get to see the presentations and hear the discussion that we're going to have. And I believe I need to pin me while I speak, and then we'll go back to the room when we talk. So just a bit of an introduction. So depending on particularly the nature of your council, you might already be across a lot of this, and I'm going to ask people to kind of input some of this as well. But one of the things that we find is that the way that you do engagement and education and things is really different depending on whether, when you're talking about residential waste and recycling, depending on whether you're engaging people who are in single unit dwellings or in multi-unit dwellings. And from our research, we see that these kind of single unit dwellings tend to be either detached or semi-detached houses, and multi-unit dwellings are basically low-rise and high-rise apartment blocks. And sometimes you might find, particularly with some of the larger kind of villa or estate kind of style, that they may technically be classified as single unit dwellings but may act more like kind of low-rise apartments. But what we have found is that some of the key characteristics of single unit dwellings is that each household has its own bins. They're responsible for those bins, and it's easy to hold them to account for those bins because you know who the bins belong to. The bins tend to be located quite close to the dwelling, and they certainly have control over where they put those bins, depending on the property that they're on, but they have some control over where they put those bins, so they're able to adapt the location of the bins to suit themselves. Depending on the service that you offer to council, whether it's to your residents, whether for your curbside collection is a scheduled or a bookable, still where it's bookable and scheduled, the household has control over that and will tend to put their material out on the curbside in front of their house. So again, there's kind of you can presume who owns material when it goes out. And if you are doing bookable, they tend to, from the anecdotes that we get, you tend to be able to allocate them a sufficient number. So if you do 2 a year, or if you do 4 a year, most single unit dwellings are happy with that number and don't tend to exceed it. You may potentially get, a short-term residency where rental block, but it's quite rare is our understanding of that. Multi-unit dwellings, on the other hand, tend to have shared bins. So particularly in high-rise, some low-rise residents still do have their own bins and they do walk them out, but most multi-unit dwellings, they have collective bins across the building. And so people use whichever bin they do, and different people's, the key characteristic is that different households put their rubbish into the same bin. So when you look at a bin, you don't know who's responsible for the waste in that bin. And other people, the overall result for the building is dependent on what everybody in the building is doing, and there can sometimes be 1 or 2 or a small number of households within a building who can be doing particularly bad or particularly poor practice, which can upset the results for a whole building, or other times it's fairly evenly spread. And one of the characteristics, particularly for high-rise multi-unit dwellings, but also for some low-rise, is that the bins are often very distant from the dwellings and often require people to walk quite away with their rubbish and recycling from their dwelling. Particularly in high-rise, again, a lot of the older high-rise buildings have on-floor rubbish, but many still actually have only recycling in the basement. And so there's not only a distance between the household and the bins, but there's actually a great distance between the rubbish and the recycling. So these are things that cause issues. With the curbside collection, often multi-unit dwellings are allotted, when they're bookable, they're allotted only a small number of bookable collections throughout the year and asked to coordinate that. So where there's a building manager, usually councils require the building manager to do the booking, or to ask residents to somehow coordinate amongst themselves. Some councils, but what the anecdote that we get is that often, particularly buildings that have a high number of renters, people moving in and out frequently, is that when people are moving out, they want the bookable collection then. And they don't want to coordinate with everybody else to say, okay, this is the building's bookable, I'm moving out, I need to put my stuff out now and I want it. So people will often ring up and use up the allotment without kind of consent of the buildings. Some councils have policies to manage that, and some councils haven't yet worked out the response. And when people do put material out on the curbside, it's difficult to know who it belongs to. So it's difficult to communicate directly to the people that are responsible for that. And one of the things that we find is that it's not, depending on your own demographics of your council, it's not that more renters live in units than in houses. They may in particular areas, but they may not. But you've got a lot of renters really close together. So it's the concentration of renters in multi-unit dwellings, which makes it difficult because of the turnover in terms of engaging them, people moving in and out, and in terms of the bulky good collections, the amount of furniture and turnover. So that often we find when we actually look at the demographics, it's not that they have a greater proportion of renters, but just that highly concentrated in one area. Looking at that, does anybody have any other things that they think really clearly distinguish like single unit dwellings from multi-unit dwellings in terms of characteristics? And like I said, if you're online, please do unmute yourself or put a hands up if you want to share anything else that you've seen in your research or in your engagement with people that is quite different.
Julie, this is not in response to that question directly, but I am finding that the new developments have building managers and they have contactable cleaners. It's a lot more efficiency and it's much easier to get to the people than it used to be.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really good point, and one of the reasons why we really like to distinguish multi-unit dwellings between low-rise and high-rise is that our experience is that high-rise are much more likely to have building managers and to have employed building managers. Low-rise we don't have any statistics on it, but they seem to be a mix of have building managers or not building managers, and the building managers often tend to be just champions or residents who have volunteered, may or may not get some, recompense for that job, but they're often just residents, and so the building managers can change as residents move in and out. Low-rise buildings, what we find is tend to have a little bit more of a community. So they tend to know people in their building a lot more. Again, anecdotally, the research tends to suggest that in high-rise, people are actually less community-minded. So there's a lot of people, they're really closely dense, that they tend to be more, like when they're travelling down in the lifts, they say they don't like people seeing them carrying rubbish. They don't like people knowing what they're doing. So they're actually a little bit more individualistic. Single-unit dwellings on streets, people tend to be more or less connected based on the length of their residency there, but it seems to be easier to get people in single unit dwellings and in low rise to connect to a sense of community. So either this is your street or this is your building. High rise seems to be different from that. That's one of the other differences.
We've also noticed in a lot of the high-rise buildings that we deal with, some still have chutes, so it takes away that ownership again of what they're doing with their waste. They just throw it down the chute.
Yeah.
A lot is still being built with chutes.
No, really? No,
yeah, there's not an old thing. It's
a lot of the old ones we deal with chutes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, some of the research that we've done, because we did some looking at international best practices, that where the chutes are designed fit for the purpose, so you know what your waste streams are and the chutes are designed to match those waste streams because your planning controls are getting you the outcomes that you want, or the developers are just doing it anyway. They can actually be really effective, and particularly in highly dense urban areas in Southeast Asia, they're the only way that they do them, and they do them really well. Where you've got technology, there's technology that's coming, like that they've got that we don't have in Australia, but where you can actually get that individual ownership by they actually having tap on and things like that. So you can't access the chute unless you tap on. So some sort of, card or things like that. In some places I think it's in Seoul, in Korea, you actually put your credit card onto the chute and then you open it up and you put your material in there and it scans it optically. and checks what's in there and weighs it, and then it charges your credit card as you put it down. So talk about instant feedback. But obviously they were designed fit for purpose. So
sorry, I just want to tell you a message popped up from somebody.
Thank you. I just saw that. So Vanessa has just said individuals in their area. So Vanessa's in Queanbeyan and Palorang. Individuals place bins on the curbside for collection, whereas multi-units have bin areas where the waste contractors actually come and collect. So that's also a point about where are the bins. Single unit dwellings, generally, obviously, they're responsible for doing their own bins. In multi-unit dwellings, there usually be one or a small number of people who are responsible for putting them on. But yes, also that's a good point that often where the bins are actually presented for pickup can be different. If they actually have contractors actually have to drive down and collect them from within the buildings, that can affect things like doing bin audits and visual inspections. And Vanessa has also said EPA have just put out a paper for comment on design of multi-unit waste systems to talk about chutes and sinkerators. So yes, and was someone just trying to join in the conversation online then?
No, Jenny, that was me. I was transferring from laptop to phone.
Oh, not a problem. Okay. So these characteristics are part of what means that the way we approach them needs to be different. One of the things that we found in our research, so we've looked specifically at multi-unit dwellings for 3 different councils, is that there are no magic answers for multi-unit dwellings, and high-rise buildings at the moment particularly seem to be the most problematic. And we think that has to do with a combination of, one, the individualism that people find when they're closely located to everybody in that really dense, they seem to have a drawing away, so less of a sense of a community. They tend to have building managers that are responsible for stuff, so they can shift responsibility onto other people. They can also get much more of a sense of what's called free riding or social loafing, where they can get away with not doing enough because other people are doing it, or alternatively feel like they're doing the right thing but other people aren't, and not be able to address that with them. Whereas in low rise, like I said, a bit more of a community, you might tend to have champions formally or informally who know what's going on and talk to people. Some of that can be a bit more intrusive and not done well, but there tend to be people who are passionate about that. So our research suggests that there are some things that seem to work in certain places, but when they're transferred, they don't work the same way. Sometimes that can be characteristics of how they're designed. It can be characteristics of the community, but we haven't found any silver bullets to this question. What I'm going to do is just share with you a summary. And like I said, this is very intuitive and made very much from anecdotal information. So there's not a huge evidence base behind what I'm going to show you. I'm a bit nervous about it as a researcher, but I still feel like intuitively it's capturing a lot of what we're hearing from people and in the case studies that we look at. So what I've tried to do is go through a number of approaches that we've seen either from published research and evaluation or anecdotally from people discussing the programs that they've done, and trying to look at how easy it is to do a particular approach with the group and then how effective it seems to be. A lot of that effectiveness is judged through visual audits, not through weight-based or sorting audits. So visual audits are fairly unreliable, depending on how you do them. A piece of research that SS Rock did on multi-unit dwellings that we did the analysis for found that visual audits correlated with the results of physical audits only 50% of the time, and 50% of the time they gave a different result. So they were checking contamination and they were trying to decide buildings below or above 10%. And what they found was 50% of the time when the physical audit found above or below, 50% the visual audit also placed them above or below. 25% of the time when they were below 10, sorry, I should have said 10%, below 10%, the visual audit said they were above 10%, and 25% of the time when the physical audit said they were above, the visual audit said they were below. So 50% of the time, the visual audit was not actually telling you what the full bin contents were doing, but still they remain, the only really cost-effective way that most people have to be looking, at the contents of the bin. So the first kind of approaches that we have is literally delivering of information, and what we find is that letterboxing is pretty easy thing to do. It's actually often easier for multi-unit dwellings because all your letterboxes are concentrated, so it's actually easier to deliver. You don't have to travel as far. But it seems to get a fairly average response in terms of actually getting any change from people just delivering things in letterboxes. What's interesting is that some of the councils in Melbourne, as part of their MUDs project, actually looked at delivering, instead of putting information in the letterbox, actually sliding information under the door. They only tried it for MUDs, and they actually found it was much easier in high-rise where there were building managers, because they could get permission of the building manager to do it. They come in with our council, request permission and receive that permission, so they can, one, get access because there's someone to let them in, and two, the building manager is there to allay the concerns of anybody who gets the message to be able to say yes, yes, I let them in, yes, this is all thing. Whereas in low rise, it can actually be more difficult to get access into a low rise building, and they found that had much better results than letterboxing, but they also tailored the letters to a particular building. So when they went into a building, they actually, if they were giving information, for example, they actually gave, information based on that building. And in some cases, they actually, instead of doing a postcard where they ticked, this was what was, we found, they actually did a letter where they ticked, but they were still tailored to the person that they were doing. The next lot is kind of direct engagement, door knocking. So what we found is that door knocking is most easiest in single unit dwellings, because you can walk straight up to the door in almost all cases, sans any sort of large dog in the front yard. Low rise is actually often harder than high rise, as I said, because often there's not a building manager or a reception or someone to let you in. And door knocking, apparently the response to door knocking is actually better in single unit dwellings, because often, particularly in multi-unit dwellings where there is security, people don't have people knocking on their door. So when someone knocks on the door, it can be quite confronting. And so actually, in terms of actually being able to engage people in conversation, people are like, what are you doing here? And so they're less likely to engage. That can be mitigated by, advising people in advance, putting notices on notice boards and in lifts saying, hey, we're coming to your building to tell you, those sorts of things. The two things that we've tried is combining door knocking with a pledge. So actually, as part of your conversation, actually getting people to commit to, trying to, waste less, trying to not use plastic bags, trying to whatever it is that you're trying to do. And that was actually particularly good for low-rise buildings where, again, a bit of a sense of community, and has been, I think, Bankstown, they did it where they did a pledge, and then they actually did a poster of all the people who have pledged. So they actually published who had and hadn't pledged. And yeah, definitely that's got good results in the street, where they've done a street-based thing, and then they've actually sent letters to the whole street saying who did and didn't pledge, or in low rise. And high rise, just anecdotally, again, this set's difficult to make the sense of community, difficult to put information if you're putting a poster up where everybody would see it, but still certainly much more effective than just delivering information, getting people to make a commitment. Delivering a recycling tub. Sorry, I think I've been talking too long. Delivering a little recycling tub, one of the things that often comes up in research is that particularly in high rise, but also in low rise, apartment space for different bins is one of the biggest issues, and one of the reasons that people use plastic bags is simply because there's not enough space for the bin, so they hang a plastic bag on the door. Sorry, this should actually say, I think it's actually much better. The tub is better in low rise. So one of the difficulties with the tub in high rise is that you have to pick up the tub, you have to carry it all the way down to the basement, and then you have to take the tub back. And so most people want to take it out on their way to somewhere, so they put it in a plastic bag so that when they get down there, they just leave it and then they can continue out. So one of the things that we were actually looking at was the idea of using a tub where the tub system is managed by the building. So if you think about IKEA, where you pick up a bag at the front of the building and you use it all the way in, then you drop it off at the end, and then someone else is responsible for moving it back and when you come back in. We did a very, very small, like we only talked to about 10 people, about people's feelings about whether that would work. And there was definitely some interest. There was, a bit of a, nobody wanted to say yes. Yeah, of course I would do that. But yeah, there was like, yeah, maybe that would work. Maybe I could use that. So that's something that we don't think has been trialled yet. But that idea of involving building managers, obviously relies on committed building managers who are going to get themselves or their cleaners or whoever to actually be taking them from the bin bay, cleaning them if they need to be cleaned, or their recyclings, can be cleaner than rubbish, and then putting them back into wherever it is that people are going to get them on their way back to the building. And foyer stalls, whether they're on the lawn or inside the foyer, tend to, again, be easier in low-rise because there tends to be more space around the building. But certainly the feedback that we've got is that they haven't been particularly effective. Getting people to even stop and engage has been really hard. So just looking at those two, does anybody have anything they'd like to add about those two groups of approaches and your own experiences?
Picking the right time, if you're to have face-to-face conversation, that's quite important as well. Can't be too late, can't be too early.
Yeah. After work, after school, before dinner.
Yeah.
We did that with our photo trial, trying to get it.
Yeah.
Through that.
Any other thoughts? I can keep going, but I don't want to just be too much.
We've run a similar project. Do you want me to jump in now?
Sure. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so I'm Stephanie from Envirocom. We do education from Queensland all the way down to Victoria. We're kind of like a jack of all trades, to do waste segregation audits all the way down to a school program. We run a couple of MUDS trials for a few clients with heavily cold community groups, and similar to what Jen's saying, the trick with MUDS is there's a high turnover rate of residents, you don't have complete ownership of the bin, etc., etc. So to get the right resource for this particular client, we did a little pilot program where we did a series of interventions to find something that actually worked for them so that they could keep doing it without our assistance. So we had to find something that was cost effective for them, but also yielded the results that they wanted to see. So we picked 3 categories for the MUDs. So one was a small mud dwelling, a medium mud dwelling, and a large mud dwelling. And then we did a series of interventions. So the first intervention was a simple letter drop, which we're all familiar with. That was really good. It had translation on the back, so it was in English and had a few images, but on the back actually transferred that into, I think, 4 different languages. And then the second intervention was about 4 weeks to 5 weeks later, which was stickers on the bins. The third intervention was actual Corel signage, so the bin bays. We did dual, 1 recycling and 1 waste signage. And the fourth intervention was actually door knocking. And similar to what you're saying, we had a series of times we had to go to try and capture as many audience as possible. With the door knocking, we did hand out 27 litre tubs with some flyers as well. And what we found was, so the letters obviously were the most, yielded the best results. They had a contamination drop of about 60%. So before we started an intervention, we did a baseline survey and measured the whole 18 MUDs that we picked. So 6 MUDs from each category group, small, medium and large. They had the best results from the baseline audit to the final audit, but with each intervention, we only picked 2 to move on to the next intervention. So we actually picked the worst MUDs to continue on to the next intervention. So intervention 2, the stickers, they had about, I think it was a 40% drop. And then intervention 3 had a 30% contamination drop. And interestingly enough, the door knock only had about 20. And when I was reading it this morning, I thought that was a bit low because I thought surely the face-to-face engagement would yield the best results. But there's so many other factors going on there because it was a cold community where we're primarily English speaking. Maybe it was a case of bringing someone with us who could translate. I only did a couple. We rolled this out just before I went on maternity leave, so I only did a few. And the anecdotal feedback we got when door knocking was the tubs were great, but I think there's something going on behind the scenes, similar to what Jen said, is people carrying it down to the bin bays and back became a bit of an issue. So overall, it was pretty good. The client was happy to continue with the letters. The interesting thing that I noticed was the bin Corel. So even though the letters yielded the best results, the bin fullness for the recycling bin actually was highest for the bin corral intervention. So we don't know if that's a mixture of visitors coming in or when people actually carry down their stuff to the bin bays and they can actually see that visual resource above the bin. So even though their contamination rate was only about, I think, 30% drop from baseline to the final report, their bin fullness for the recycling bins was quite good, up to 80 to 90%. So it showed the most increase in capturing that resource. So yeah, there are a couple of things that we've used, and then we continue to hand that information over to the client and say, obviously, if you have the money, please implement all 4, which is never the case because no one's got surplus money. And then we say you're best off to do the letter drop and then have intermediate interventions of the other ones, specifically the bin corrals.
Can I ask a question about your letter? Was it a encouraging, happy letter, or was it there's a problem?
No, it's education focused, so very encouraging. It had some images as well to tackle that cold community aspect. And it wasn't an enforcement letter, it was an encouraging letter to say we're trying to boost the use of the recycling bins. Yeah.
When we've used letters, so from Clean Away, we do education and resource recovery for several councils within Sydney. So we do, depending on the stage of contamination, so in some councils we do first contamination, second and third contamination. So we do just a combination of different ones. So the first, we do a lot of stickering as well as tagging, depending on the council. And the letters that we have, they're pretty straightforward and just, so say for example, in the first contamination, your bin has been contaminated and we highlight the materials that we're seeing visually as to be contaminating. And then we just say your bin has been collected this time. And then we just let them know. And then if it's the same, if it's a second time contamination, similar letter, but we let them know this is the second time your bin's been contaminated, and based on the level of contamination, whether or not it's been collected or not. And yeah, so if it's and with the level of contamination, it depends on what agreement the council has to set the bar with that. And then the third time contamination, we've got second time usually maybe they receive a letter or a postcard, depending on what works with the council. And then there's a door knocking, and then eventually, if not a lot of councils won't go this route, but in some cases, if needed, the bin could be removed from the resident, and then they then have to follow up with council to have that rectified.
I've been hearing, so much in the last couple of weeks that the postcards are the way to go. I'm going to go back and start pushing the postcards.
Actually interesting because I was just going to say, we have got some feedback that letters often carry a council authority, and where you can address them to the street or the unit, even if you don't have the name, you can address them to the house. That our anecdotal evidence, because we haven't done any trials where they've been compared, suggests that letters actually seem to get more read because postcards can often look like flyers, like advertising, and it's easier to kind of do it. Whereas if you get a letter with a council logo on it, that authority says, I need to read this. So one of the difficulties with most information is just getting people to look at it best. So that, it'd be interesting.
We currently do both. On the first inspection, it's a letter and a postcard.
I also found that I had markedly better results when I had the time to go to the apartment block and take photographs of the contaminated bins in situ. So you make sure that you had some of the background that the residents could see it was their bin storage. Maybe you could recognise some of the contamination in the bins and then address them to the resident. Just marked kind of success.
Well, so what I might do, unless anyone else, so anyone online, I've just got a couple of comments. So I've got a comment from Vanessa saying at No Waste, they're doing a mud research study at the moment, so they're trialling a couple of different things in terms of signage and stuff like that. And I was just thinking to Stephanie and to all of you, one of the things that we find when we do literature reviews is that a lot of projects are evaluated in-house by council, and that evaluation report stays in council. So one of the questions that I want to pose to the group is we're talking about MUDs today at the moment, but for each topic, what information do you have currently about MUDs in reports or things like that you might be able to share with the group, maybe just by providing just the executive summary, or, you know, getting permission to share a confidential version of a report. What material do you have about things that you've tried and lessons that you have that we could share with this group? Because one of the difficulties that we certainly find as a research agency doing literature reviews is that most of the knowledge that we find comes from talking to councils because they haven't been able to make their results public. So yeah, I'd certainly be interested to know if your client might be willing to consider. And sometimes, you know, we just do a redacted version. Like often there is information about council, about residents, or you know, things that there's concern about putting it out in the thing. So we often just go through and delete entire sections and just say, you know, section removed, and basically redact any information. And it doesn't take very long to just make a public version just by skimming and going, no, that's not allowed, that's not allowed, that's not allowed, but here's the bits that are, and putting it out. And sometimes even those bits are still really helpful, even if you have to remove information. So, and I'll just read from Brody says, oh yes, sorry, I called it Act No Waste, ACT, I meant ACT, sorry, thanks Vanessa. Too many things on my mind, so just got to do this again. And Brody has said that definitely one of the things about door knocking is that it actually depends very much on who you send. So Brody said particularly with gender. So in their area, people are less likely to open the door to a male voice than they are to a female voice. So that's a thing. And one of the things that we've certainly found in our research suggests that people are much more likely to respond to people who seem like them. So that's both in demographics, so literally age, gender, ethnicity, you know, those sorts of things, but also in approach. And one of the things that our general research, which hasn't been tested in waste door knocking, says that people respond to either authority, where they respect authority, and most people respect councils, and most trust in government, where you've seen a decline, tends to be decline in trust in state and federal government. I don't know your experiences, but hasn't seemed to have affected local government as much. So authority, experts, so actually having people who are somehow recognisable as being an expert in this, or the same. And one of the so people who don't know. And one of the things that we found in the feedback from Craig Rucastle's War on Waste, where he got an entire street to eventually participate, all but 2 people in households on an entire street. 1, they spent 4 months recruiting, just recruiting to get that. But 2, what people said was Craig rocked up and said, hey, I don't know any more about this than you do. Do you want to learn with me? And people really responded to that. Hey, this guy's on our level. He's not, you know, telling us what to do. So a couple of things about door knocking there. So I'll
just going on that, they respond better to women, or more likely to open the door to women. They also respond much more angrily to men. So we found that really clearly. We had an issue where we sent the wrong letter to a street full of people, which was quite unpleasant. And angry people literally only looked at Matt and abused him and didn't acknowledge that Livia was there. And that happened multiple times. So that's also interesting to consider.
Perhaps I can share some experience when I've worked for a short project for Strathfield at a Homebush area for a multi-ethnic. So we work in a capacity with ethnic community council. So we have a boy-girl team. Send out in early evening when people tend to be home. You can never cater for so many different languages out there, but there is always someone nearby that we can call and say, hey, here's a group of people who speak this language, can you come back and visit them? And once you get access to the building, you get a female voice to say, hey, can you open the door for me within the council? With door knocking, you can just say, hey, we'll just do a quick survey because there seems to be some problems with the bin. We want to do a quick test with you, quick survey to see if you're putting the right thing in the bin. And you can bypass the language barrier by using little pictures of items and just go through a 1-minute quick game. So it seems a lot less threatening than just saying directly, hey, you're getting it wrong, we're here to tell you what to do. Yeah.
That's a really good point, Louis. One of the other things, sorry, I just have to keep doing this because we're recording. is that often when you want people to do something for you, like either you actually want them to join a project or something like that, or you want them to do a pledge, it's called foot in the door technique. Get them to do something, it's called, I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, it's related to foot in the door, but anyway, you get them to do something small and easy for you, they're more likely to say yes to your next request. One of the things that can be really effective is to start off engagement with a short survey. We're just doing a 3-question survey. Would you mind answering these 3 questions for us? And people will often say, oh yeah, I'll answer 3 questions. So they do the survey, and then you say, and we're also doing this, would you like to know more, or could I talk to you about this, or could I, whatever. And having said yes to do the survey, they will often then say yes to the next thing. So it can actually be a thing. Obviously, the survey can be useful and make sure that you're using it and it's useful, but it can be a technique to then actually get a longer conversation. So that's another thing. So if I come back to here, so these are kind of the sort of really standard engagement, delivering information or talking face-to-face. The next group of approaches that we looked at are based on feedback. So doing some sort of audit or inspection of the bin and then providing feedback to people. We don't have any information about the relative ease of doing audits on bins across SUDs, MUDs, and other than the note that sometimes the bins aren't presented on street for some particular high-rise developments. But in terms of their effectiveness, what we find is really interesting is that these groups really do operate differently, particularly low-rise. And high-rise and sometimes low-rise are more like SUDs and sometimes they're more like high-rise. So what we found is that bin tags are by far and away better for SUDs than they are for MUDs, so they just don't really work that well for MUDs. There are a number of issues with doing bin tags and doing them well, and a couple of them are things like social norms. If everybody's getting it wrong, it's making it clear that it's okay that that's everybody else is getting it wrong, so it's okay if I do, so that doesn't encourage better performance. There's a lot of concern that other people can see the tag that they get, so there's a bit of concern about that, but they are used fairly effectively for single unit dwellings. The next one that was checked was a postcard, so they did an audit and then you actually put the postcard into the letterbox. What they found is that particularly in low-rise and high-rise, postcards giving you feedback didn't, and this is a combination of the Bankstown Recycle Right results and a Melbourne Yarra MUDs program, is that the postcards weren't really effective in MUDs at all. Melbourne found that delivering letters after the audit to MUDs was much more effective than the postcards, and in some cases they were just letterboxed letters, but as I said, in other cases they put them under the door, and definitely under the door was more effective than letterbox. Door hangers particularly were not found to be at all effective in high rise, and we can speculate again that idea about people coming to your door in a high rise, because I'm doing this for those people who can see me just to represent that feeling of kind of walling yourself off from people because you're so surrounded by other people. But one of the concerns about door hangers, particularly for SUDs and less for low rise, is that if you put a door hanger on someone's door and they're away, it actually indicates to other people that there's no one home, and so there's a concern that you can be letting criminals basically know that houses are empty if you do it. So that's one concern. Less of a concern in low rise and MUDs, because you're only letting the people within that floor or that building, and they tend to be neighbours. Posters, again, this was the Bankstown Recycle Right one, where they actually did, and it's been done in a few other places where they do communal performance for a building, and this is much more effective where either you've got a pledge or you've got some sort of community existing in the building and you're talking about the building's performance. Your building is doing this. That's got some good results, again, for low rise, because it's tapping into that idea of community, but also because they often tend to know who isn't doing the right thing, and so elements within the building can go and talk to other people. One of the things that we found about that is, again, that where you've got low rise and high rise, one of the issues is that you've either got a lot of people doing the right thing and a few people not doing the right thing, or you've got people who think they're doing a lot of people who think they're doing the right thing but aren't, and you can have different kind of things there. And when you put up the performance in the building, if people don't see themselves in that performance, so maybe it's really it's fairly poor performance, but they say, but I'm a good recycler, then it's very easy for them to dismiss it and say, no, that's not me, that's everybody else in the building. But similarly, where you've got a few people who are doing not the right thing, but a lot of people are, they can see good performance and go, oh, what I'm doing is okay. So one of the real difficulties with MUDs is making sure that you are reinforcing the right behaviour. And so making sure that you don't just go, yeah, you guys did good, keep doing what you're doing, if it's not perfect, right? So thinking about the messages, one of the things that we find is just this is actually can be quite problematic because it can actually be reinforcing some behaviours that are bad. So having more of a kind of, oh, that's good, but, you know, that's really good, we're getting closer, but always have a further point is one thing that can help with that. And one of the things that was, one of the other approaches that was done was doing the visual audits and then actually door knocking and telling people what they saw. That got a great response in low rise when it was trialled. I can't remember if it was in Bankstown, but it was certainly, I don't know, but it was certainly in the Melbourne one where they basically went and knocked on the door, said we're going to be doing this, and then they came back and knocked on the door and they could have a conversation about it. They had photos to be able to show, and that was really effective. And certainly that idea about tailored information and having photos of the building, one of the things you want is you want people to recognise this is me. I'm talking about me. So you can get, if you're using letters and you're putting photos in the letters, you know, you're really connecting with people to say this is information that's directly related to you. And then one of the things that we just thought was interesting is that it's street-based events, if you're trying to get an entire street together, works best in streets that are basically all SUDs. Trying to get high-rise people to relate to a street-based thing is virtually impossible, and low-rise really depends on the make of the building. So how much are they actually part of the street and how much are they separate from the street? Building-based, again, if you want to create a sense of community or a group, low-rise is much easier than high-rise. Interestingly, social media, one of the things that we've found is that trying to get people on a street to be part of a street social media is much harder than trying to get people in a building to be part of a building social media. Low-rise tends to be better. Often people in low-rise, because they don't have building managers and they're trying to manage their building, there are actually a number of buildings that already have existing social media groups, Facebook groups, whatever, LinkedIn groups for the residents in the building, and they're already using it. So where you can find those and tap into them, they can be really effective ways of sharing information socially. Where they don't exist already, it's hard to get them up. High-rise tend to less often have them. Again, that, you know, less sense of community, but also there's a building manager who communicates formally. Building managers don't, in our experience so far, haven't tended to use social media to communicate with their building participants. So our experience is that we've had a lot of trouble finding evidence of where social media has led in any way to measurable changes in bins. We haven't found any evidence of that yet, but we have found, except where an existing social media group already existed for the building. And then finally, just a couple of other things to note. Engaging building managers, obviously there needs to be a building manager to do that, and as I said before, high-rise is often easier to engage. So where you're looking at that, segmenting units based on the number of apartments, you're more likely to find building managers. For low-rise, you probably actually need to find resident champions rather than building managers. And real estates, engaging real estates to obviously help with the rental and turnover issue. We've found some really mixed feedback about people who have done this. We've found people who have done this and got really great results from it, and were able to effectively engage real estate agents and then actually have the real estate agents demonstrate that they had been doing what they committed to. Other people have had trouble other councils have had trouble just engaging real estates, or they've engaged the real estates but then the real estates haven't done anything. And it seems to be really based on a couple of things. Apparently real estate agents really like things that are targeted at low rise because they often have more than one building or more than one unit in the building. They're actually familiar with the building. So if you've got things that you're dropping off, like maybe you're giving them a tub and, you know, a calendar or whatever, they're more likely to go to higher dense areas and places where they've got multiple units than they are for single unit dwellings and streets. So I thought that was quite interesting. But again, the information, like we've looked at results where they said, we asked real estates, could we give them an electronic pack that they just email to everybody every time they sign a tenancy? and every time they get a letter of, not resignation, what do you do when you're leaving?
Termination.
Yeah. So when someone's vacancy, when they say we're leaving, so they get a, hey, you're new to the building, here's your information, or hey, you're leaving, here's your curbside collection information. Some real estate agents have got, oh my goodness, give me, and sent it out. And councils have gone, wow, this is fabulous, we're just going to do this forever now. And other councils have said, oh, sorry, I hope that's just...
Jenny, strata managers are quite helpful in doing that, in relaying the information to the individual property managers, which are real estate agents.
Yes, yeah, strata. And that,
Yeah.
Sorry, keep going.
Because they have all the details of all the tenants and all the landlords and all that.
Yeah, so that's one that we actually haven't had any success in engaging in the work that we've done, engaging strata managers, but it would be interesting to see the experiences that other people where they've done it successfully. So that's like I said, this is just me picking case studies and using them to assign things, and I did it just for this meeting. So this is not evidence-based research. It's just my feeling about all of the bits of work that I've done. So I won't give you this as a slide that you can share, but it will be in the recording, so you can go online to see it. But please do note, this is literally my intuitive summary of this information, and it would be much better to get real research results to actually put a more evidence-based version of this. Does anyone want to share anything else around those other groups that we're looking at, around different ways of giving feedback or engaging?
Strata sometimes appreciate you coming forward with some infrastructure, big signages for the room, and so that's a good initial engagement. And then they'll say, okay, I'll let you be in touch with someone in the building to let you in, and then you can establish long term. But as you said, it's very variable between different real estate companies. I think Vanessa might have something message as well. Someone might have posted something.
Yep, so Vanessa's also said body corporate meetings is a good way to be able to share information. Often you need to go through strata to get to body corporate, and that's where we've found it difficult, where we can go through resident champions to body corporate. We've found that much more effective, but finding the champions is hard. Finding the strata is easy. Getting them to pass on, we've found.
It depends on, like, with the body corporate, how many of them are leased out as opposed to owners as well. So it can be kind of a bit pointless sometimes going if it's a high rental building.
Yeah, because even when you do find the champion, you would find that when you do organise educational sessions for that building, the people who attend the buildings are the people who attend the meetings are the ones who are interested in recycling and hence are recycling, and then the ones who are not recycling and don't care don't go to those meetings. So you're kind of like, what am I doing here, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a bit difficult in that regard as well. Have you guys had, what are your experiences with actually passing on fines to strata about their bin bay rooms? Is there, like, do you guys have much opinions about that, or if that works, do they then pass on the responsibility of the fines to residents who they believe are contaminating, or
Fines for what
for contamination? So after like a 3-strike system. With
the legality of that. When I was looking into it, from the pair area, which I'm assuming is what you're looking at that for, you have to assign it to an individual. It cannot be assigned to a body.
Right.
So it's not legal to give a fine to a strata under POEO.
Right.
It has to be assigned to an individual, and it has to be an individual that you believe is not offence. It's hard to do no ownership. Yes.
Right.
Just on that last
Sorry,
one.
is there someone on the line who wanted to say anything?
Would anyone from council, especially Canterbury Bankstown Council, be willing to address this at an AGM in the evening in December? You'll have basically executive committee.
Where at? Where is it a building?
It's it's in Bankstown.
Maybe we should take that offline.
We'll happily consider it.
You'll get our contact details at the end
Yes.
of today, and we can follow up any questions.
Well, my other thing
That'll be great.
because I've looked with real estates as well, and the big issue that I have is that I can get information on which strata is associated with which building, but you cannot find information on which real estate unless you trawl through every single listing, and the majority of the real estates that operate in my area at least are not located within our area. So people are getting real estates who,
might have been that they have multiple properties or something. So you can find that a real estate is located 40 minutes away. So pursuing a real estate is really problematic, and also because the number of real estate agents is really high compared to the number of strata corporations.
Yeah, so we've certainly had that feedback, and the projects that we've looked at in Australia, the two of them, they did, we're going to have to leave very shortly, they did literally do searches for all of the ones in the area, but we've actually been talking to someone over in the US. This won't mean anything to you, but it's called an API. It's actually a program that goes online and actually scrapes out data from the back end of online things. There's actually a way to actually pull out all of the listings into basically Excel and to be able to filter them by suburb and things like that. It's something that we are interested in looking into more to see if there's a way. We do have to go. It's just gone 2 o'clock, but I want to thank everybody for coming along. I want to suggest that our next meeting, which we were just going to confirm by email, but we're looking at Tuesday the 4th of December. Does anybody know anything really obviously like a WESROC meeting that conflicts with the 4th of December? Anybody on the line or Vanessa, just share your comments while we're just looking at that date. So I might share them by email. So there's some good information there. So anyone know anything obvious about the 4th of December, Tuesday lunchtime? No. Okay, we'll get in touch. A few people volunteered to host meetings. We'll get in touch with you directly and we'll pick the topic. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for you guys online particularly. I really would be interested in your feedback about how this went for you, whether it was valuable, whether it you can think of any ideas of being able to engage you better. So please do drop me an email afterwards if you have any thoughts about this meeting. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you very much, Jenny.
Thanks, Jenny. That was great.